Hi, folks. Happy Sunday and happy week 9 of Tadaima. It's honestly hard to believe that we are here, but I'm so excited to be introducing one of the speakers for this next panel. I am joining from Providence, Rhode Island, which is situated on the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. And I'm really excited to introduce Sho Tanaka, who will give us more context for this panel and about himself, but Sho is a Yonsei with roots in Juneau, Alaska. So Sho, thank you so much for being here. We are so looking forward to hearing about your work and some of these stories.
All right. Can y'all hear me? Sounds good? Hello, everyone. My name is Sho. I'm coming to you from the Wasanich and the Lekwungen territories on Vancouver Island. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the land defenders, Indigenous plant knowledge bearers, language revitalizers, frontline workers, ones who sit with the elders in prayer, and all others who are currently using their minds, bodies, and spirits in the work of decolonization. I think it's something that we're called to really turn our attention to, and it's something that hopefully we'll be looking a little bit more in the context of the incarceration historically and then contemporarily. My roots, my grandfather grew up in Juneau, Alaska. My great-grandfather, Shonosuke, immigrated from Fukuoka and started the City Cafe in Juneau. And so I have spent some time reconnecting with that family history, and in the process have met Paulette, who we'll be speaking with later, and have realized that there are a lot of connections and intersections between the Tlingit community and the Japanese American community. And so we're going to be taking some time to sort of think through what those mean and how we can sort of deepen our understanding and knowledge of them. So we can cue the first slide and we'll get going. So there's Paulette. That's the second slide, actually. That one's, I don't have anything to say about that one. So I think to start off, I just wanna like really think a little bit more about what relations mean. And I think colonization and the process of history that we've inherited as people of color, as Indigenous people, as Black people, has been really about fragmentation. And so if you look at the process of the incarceration, it was really about destroying and fragmenting the Japanese American community. People were taken from their homes, people were taken from their families. And then there's also the fragmentation that occurred on more of a spiritual level. And so people were fragmented from their histories, they were fragmented from their memories. Elders were fragmented from their children. And, you have this sort of, this loss that's very profound. And we're still, I think, this is one of the things that the pilgrimage and Tadaima is doing, is undoing that sort of fragmentation that has become part of daily life. And so it's beautiful to undo that fragmentation, but it's serious work. And so I think, as we begin to do that, I think one of the other things that's been lost that I think is really crucial, and I think we're just beginning to realize, is that our connection with the Indigenous people whose land that we've come to settle on is something that has really been destroyed. And I think as Japanese Americans, when we tell the story of our ancestors, we often don't even acknowledge the people whose land we've came to settle on and the people whose land that we're on in a contemporary sense. And so I think that, it's a land acknowledgement is one thing, but I think that the actual building of deep relationships is something that we're still have maybe visioned and would like to do, but there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think when we talk about the incarceration, our ancestors came and they fished these lands, they farmed these lands, they built cities on these lands. And oftentimes the Indigenous people whose lands these aren't even part of that story. And I think that loss in relation, that loss in understanding where we come to, because we've been focused on white histories and white America, means that there's a profound fragmentation and a profound loss. And so I think that this time we're being called to ask, what are our responsibilities as settlers? and how can we tell our stories in different ways. And it doesn't mean necessarily to vilify our elders, but it is to say that they came and were complicit in processes of colonization, and were complicit in industries, logging, these sort of things that were about sort of taking the land and harnessing it without permission and without consent of indigenous peoples. And so now it's our time to sort of rethink how we tell these stories, because that's how we transform history, because we have that ability to sort of say, okay, this is what happened, but what happens if we look at it from a different lens? And so that's sort of what I'd like to do today, and we'll talk with that Paulette later. But what does it mean to ask and center Native Alaskans, specifically today Tlingit people, in the story of the incarceration? And so, when we talk about our history, we talk about California, Alaska, Washington, but what does it mean to talk about the Native peoples whose lands we're on? And so you can see this map of Alaska, the orange in the bottom right-hand corner. I think that's how y'all are seeing it. That's Tlingit territory. And so there's a boat that came and basically took Alaskans all up and down the coast. And a large majority of the people with Native Alaskan ancestry are Tlingit. So that's whose stories I'll be focusing on today, because that's also the places that I've made connections and have built relations. And so, I think that that's sort of the grounding for the work that I hope we can do today. All right, next slide. So when we talk about relations, this is a little bit of a tangential story, but I really want to give Shoki Kayamori a shout out. Shoki was known as the picture man, and he was a migrant worker who came and settled in Yakutat, Alaska. And he was a photographer. And so because he was a photographer, he was particularly surveilled. And it's actually said that right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, there were these people who came and beat him up. And we're not really sure who, but it sounds like it was some sort of government officials. And, he had a lot of photos of the coastline, potentially. He had, but he also had a really deep relationship with the Tlingit community in Yakutat. And so, you can tell, right, like if you look at his photo collection, that he worked really closely with the community there, and he documented their, and it was a time of deep colonization. So he documented their sort of colonization, but also their cultural lives. And so it's a tragic story though, because he killed himself. I think that he knew that they were coming for him, and he didn't want to see whatever was to unfold. And so they found him dead on December 9th, just after Pearl Harbor. And so Shoki Kayamori is someone who sort of exemplifies a relationship, and not through, I think often the relationships we're talking about are through marriage and through kinship and through birth. And that, I think, is the normative dominant story, but his is a more sort of individual story. And so he was actually the first loss and to both the Japanese Alaskan and also Native Alaskan communities. And so his photography though lives on. If you go to the next slide, this is just one of many photos. There's a book called Picture Man. There's also an academic article that's been written about him. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend checking out his photography, because it provides a really beautiful look into Yakutat and Southeast Alaska at the time, pre-war. So yeah. Okay, next slide. All right, so basically, to sort of ground our conversation, there's a group of around 50 people who are part of Native Alaskan families. Most of them were mixed race. Into the family structures were mixed race, and they were taken along with the Japanese Americans. And they sort of formed, many of them were taken to Puyallup and then off to Minidoka. They also overwhelmingly, I think because they were their own community, wanted to work on the road camps. And so a lot of them went to smaller road camps quite quickly after getting to Minidoka or Puyallup. But this quote is from the Minidoka Relocation Project from a War Relocation Authority. And they say, the Alaskan group has presented problems to the administration. Many of the Alaskan evacuees of mixed ancestry spoke little or no Japanese, and their background was more Indian or Eskimo than Japanese. Most of them did not fit into the center pattern. They formed a clique of their own, and the rest of the residents accordingly left them pretty much alone. And so I think this is really interesting because I think when we talk about the incarceration, we've pretty much always said the Japanese American incarceration. And I think what that does is it creates a really pure racial narrative to say that those who were in the camps were Japanese American. And I think that then we have this story sort of the first generation were these pure Japanese people, and then the Nisei and then the Sansei started to have mixed race marriages. So by the time we get to the Yonsei and the Gosei, my generation, we have mixed race people. And I think that that's a false narrative because people have always been having relations and having sexual relations across communities. And so I think that that's a really key thing, is to say that actually, back in the wartime, there were interracial relationships, and those interracial relationships actually, played out in the dynamics in camp. And so, so I think that the Alaskan story, and specifically the Native Alaskans in camp, asks us to question that idea when we speak of the Japanese American incarceration, and actually say that there are other people there, and not only were there other people, that those people were often marginalized within the sort of dominant narratives that we tell. And so I think that, and also as I went to sort of like spend time in Alaska, you start to see how our community is really, we're working on solidarity, but there's also a lot of fear of the other. And so I think that a lot of Alaska Natives have had to work harder to be included in our community. And so I think that especially when we look back in the wartime, there's these places that we can't see, these places that our vision is lacking. And so I think that it's a really interesting, and as someone with Okinawan ancestry, to realize that there are a lot of Okinawans in camp too. And so this idea of sort of a pure Japanese race is something that haunts us, and it haunts us in the diaspora, it haunts us in the homeland. And I think that it's something that at all times needs to be questioned, because we are complicated people with roots that come from a lot of places. And so anytime that we return to that mono story of just one, of only one origin, I think we're doing ourselves a danger and a disservice. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a beautiful, striking photo of Minidoka. I want to thank Sumi Angerman, who lives in Wrangell, Alaska, who I met her at the Alaska Native Sisterhood Brotherhood Grand Camp, and she pulled out this photo. And so you can see in the center is Jessie Cake Eon, who is mourning the loss of her husband. And so her husband, John Eon. And, this is many of the people, I haven't tracked down everyone, but many of the people in this photo are Alaskan. The people, especially in the center, are Native Alaskan. Jessie is from Huna and Cake, her ancestry. I just realized my auntie just told me that my great-grandfather is in the far right of the photo. But I think that this, I don't have answers per se, but if you think about what it was like for this woman to be in a Japanese American incarceration camp, quote unquote, as a Native Tlingit woman at the time of the war, having lost her husband, it really asks us to question sort of how we have viewed the way that people have experienced incarceration. And so I think that this photo is just one sort of snapshot into the different ways. And I think we have this idea that, okay, you come and you take the Japanese away. But when it came to Southeast Alaska and Alaska, when there was intermixing between Japanese American and Tlingit communities, the government officials couldn't really decipher who was who, because the sort of racial phenotype features that they might use were not always so helpful. And so you have lots of stories, and this is, I think, there has to be, I think, more research to really say this fully, but there's lots of stories about women joining Native women joining their Japanese husbands in camp, but also with Japanese husbands staying behind, and their children are somewhere caught in between. And so you sort of have this idea where they tried to figure out how to use the model that they're using other places, but it sort of fell apart. And so this is one case where this woman, Jessie, she went to Minidoka, and she, spent her years. I think this is later in the war, because my great grandfather returned from Lordsburg. So so I think that this is a really powerful photo. So I'm grateful for Sumi for passing that on. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so Paul Ozawa is a very unique story. Paul is unique in that his incarceration was not due to either having quote unquote Japanese blood or being married to a Japanese person. Paul understood himself as a Tlingit man, and he received the last name Ozawa from a stepfather. And so, according to narratives of Blood Quantum, he wasn't quote unquote Japanese. But when the government officials came, they saw the last name Ozawa, and he actually had two half brothers who were Japanese. And I think they sort of, according to his narrative, actually, he said that they sort of were like, yeah, take him too. And so Paul Ozawa sort of entered into this really difficult relationship with the Japanese American community because, it was a hard time, but there was this sort of understanding of kinship and this understanding of, you had your family, or you had your countrymen or your fellow ethnic people to look out for you. But Paul Ozawa had neither of those things. And so what happened is they took him down. He was in Sitka. They took him down, and they wanted him to speak Japanese, but he didn't speak any Japanese. He spoke Tlingit and Haida. And so I'll read this quote from him. "By golly, I'm sure disgusted with everything. I just don't know what to do with myself. All the troubles have come at once, and it is the fault of that dumb General DeWitt. He says that I'm a Japanese, and that's why we were kicked out of Alaska. I hate the Japanese because it has caused nothing but trouble for me. I just have a Japanese name, and I don't have any Japanese blood in me. You can go down and ask the Indian Department, and they will tell you it's true. The only trouble is that I can't find any written proof of it because I don't have a birth certificate. They never took birth certificates in the town I was born in. I never knew any Japanese until I was sent down in the army transport to Puyallup." So Paul Ozawa was one of the people that was interviewed as part of a relocation survey done by a white academic supported by some Japanese American academics. He was interviewed in Chicago, and he tells his whole story. And it really illuminates the fact that, we've told the story of the Japanese American incarceration as one where we've experienced racism. But Paul Ozawa's story shows that we're just as capable of being racist. And so, I'll read this other quote real quickly. He says when he got down to Puyallup, when he went to the mess hall, everybody was gawking at him. And there was a white lady who was married to a Japanese there, and she was the only one who was friendly to us. By golly, we sure felt homesick. I was so down and out that the whole thing was a nightmare to me. So I just want to take a second to acknowledge his spirit and realize that, what would it have been like to not sort of rely on those ethnic networks that were so crucial in how Japanese Americans took care of each other during the war. What was his, and what does that say? That the people whose land that we've come to settle on, if they were at these camps, Paul had darker skin. Paul was, was more racialized in the sort of contemporary sense of the white supremacy hierarchy. And so I think that, there was a lot of hatred. And what happened is he was caught in between because they were trying to fit him into the War Relocation Authority, but he wasn't really Japanese, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs wouldn't really deal with him either because he was no longer seen as an indigenous person. And so he was caught in this sort of purgatory, which followed him from having a Japanese stepfather who deserted him to his time in Puyallup all the way to Chicago. And so I take his story as a really chance for us as a community to humble ourselves and say that as much as we received hatred, we were also capable of giving it out. And I think that really asks us to approach history a little bit differently and to sort of, there's a victim narrative that we can fall into. And I think that that's only useful to a certain extent. And to a certain extent, we're being called to ask, what are the prejudices that our community has harbored and still harbors, and how did those get enacted? And maybe Paul was only one out of thousands and thousands of people during the wartime, but that to me is just, it's, if you center his world, it really, I don't know, it's a heavy story. And so what I want to share with you next is an interview that I did with his daughter, Rhonda Ozawa. So Rhonda Ozawa, I met her through Paulette, who I'll be talking with shortly after, and she introduced me to Rhonda, and Rhonda basically sat down and just told me this really beautiful story. And so I did an hour interview with her, but this is just a 6-minute excerpt, but it gives a good look into the way that her family experienced incarceration. And I hope that you enjoy hearing her words. So so this is Rhonda Ozawa being interviewed in Sitka, Alaska, around 5 years ago.
When I first found out, I was 18 years old. My dad brought me this letter and said, I want you to type it. And I said, oh, okay. I thought it was just a normal letter until I typed it and realized that my dad was talking about what had happened to them when they were Japanese interned. Being 18 years old, I had no clue that this even happened. So when I got done typing the letter and got off of work, I went home and I asked my dad, what is this? And he's like, Rhonda Sue, just don't worry about it. And I was like, no. What happened to you and Mom? And he was like, just talk to your mom. So I went to my mom and I said, Mom, why? What is this? And she was like, Rhonda Sue, what happened in the past is in the past. There's enough hatred in this world. We didn't want you to hate. The U.S. Marines came in with their bayonets, found my dad, stuck a bayonet in his face and said, you're a Jap, you're coming with us, put him on a boat, went to my mom's house, rounded up my mom, and my mom tried to show her birth certificate. And they were like, no, you're a Jap, you're coming with us. Everything in the house was left. I have no clue what happened to all their treasures or their belongings. All I know is my mom said she only had time to put her coat on, and she was put on a junk, she called it. They met up in Seattle, and my mom was pregnant with my oldest brother, Richard. And she said, to this day, even though my mom's in heaven, she'd probably never eat rice again, because that's all they gave them was rice and bread. But there was other families, I guess, that handed fruit through the barbed wire. And my mom said the U.S. Army came to my dad and said, Paul Ozawa, you're going to speak Japanese for us and you're going to help us. My dad said no and started speaking fluent Tlingit to them. And they're like, well, you're no good to us. Same with my mom. My mom couldn't. She spoke fluent Haida, but no Japanese. But the U.S. Army said, okay, we don't want you here no more, so we're going to ship you to Montana to work on a farm. So they relocated my mom and dad from here, shipped them from Seattle, where they got off the junks, went to Montana, Havre, Montana, where my brother Richard was born, the oldest brother, and basically worked on the farm. That's how they made their living. Then, from there, my dad, he sang on the radio to make money. He worked on farms. My mom was a housekeeper. And from there, from Havre, Montana, they made it all the way to Chicago. Okay. My brother Raymond was born in Chicago. They worked their way, whether it be railroad, farms, singing, housekeeping, they made their way all the way back to Seattle. And then my brother Ronnie was born. And then from there, they finally made it back to Alaska, where they made it back to Cloak. And that's where my sister Renee was born. And I asked Renee the other night, my oldest sister, she lives in California, I said, okay, why don't I have Japanese on there? And she's like, Rhonda, Dad didn't want you to go through what they went through. And I'm like, just being Japanese? The rest of us were born here in Sitka. And my dad was a painter, a sign painter, a foreman, a fisherman. My mom was a homemaker, made sure all 11 of us children were safe. They took everything. So when they got this letter and said, okay, here's our apology. Like I said, my mom just threw it at me and said, you can burn it. It doesn't mean anything to me. And I was like, Mom, you know, that's an important letter. And she's like, no, not from what they did to us, what they took away from us, what they're making us have to tell our children, you know. And she goes, yes, Rhonda, we live in America, but it wasn't America back then.
All right. So thank you to Rhonda for sharing those words. And I just want to uplift her story and say that I hope that when we think about what it means to make and create Japanese American community today, that we hold her story in our hearts and we think about the ways that we have maybe not always welcomed people, and you know, she's a bearer of her family story and has done a lot of work. And so I hope that over time she's able to really let that story unfold and take flight. And so, yeah, so hi, Paulette.
Hi, Cheryl. Good afternoon.
So now's the time where we get to talk. This is I guess the COVID hangout. This is really good. So I mean, I'll let Paulette introduce herself, but I'll just say briefly that, you know, I met Paulette I think 8 years ago now or something, a long time ago, and Paulette just sort of took me under her wing and welcomed me back to Alaska. I think that, you know, all of my ancestors have left Southeast Alaska. And so I had this sort of calling to do work in conversation with them, but didn't necessarily have a home there. And so Paulette has offered so generously that home for me. And so I'm really grateful to be able to share this space with her. And I'm really grateful that she has done so much work in sort of holding our two communities and letting them live and breathe. We have a personal connection in that my great grandfather and her grandfather both worked in the restaurant industry in Southeast Alaska, and so we don't quite know exactly their connection, but we know that they probably cooked some good maybe Chinese food or Japanese food together. And so we hold that as we work together, and let them pull some strings and guide our way on this journey that we're on, and sort of exploring the past. So, Paulette, do you want to just quickly say a couple words and introduce yourself?
Goodness sheesh. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm of my mother's people, the Kline D, Raven Dog Salmon from the village of Aquan, the Big Dipper House, the Yox Tit House. I'm a child of the Kagwantan on my father's side, and I would like to acknowledge the Wishkatan, our opposite clan. We are here in Sitka, Shikakwan, Alaska right now, where our home is. And I'd like to acknowledge the people of this area for the land and the resources that it provides. My mother, Harriet Miyasato Moreno Beleal, is half Japanese and half Tlingit, which is an Alaska Native tribe. My father is Tlingit from Yakutat, Alaska area, and he is half Hispanic, which is where the Moreno comes from. So I am half Tlingit, a quarter Japanese, and a quarter Hispanic. So I'm very pleased to be here today. And yes, Jeff and I's connection goes back through time to our great grandfathers, and he was familiar the moment that I seen him. And I think our journey, as many of your journeys, are interconnected. So I'm pleased to be here, and I would like to say a special hello to those who are visiting with us today. And as I'm with you, I can hear the raindrops out the window. We are in a deep rainforest, and it's really beautiful. The designs behind me are some of our form line designs. So thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. I thank you for the time.
All right, so we'll get right into it. I'm gonna hopefully ask Paulette some good questions. I think sometimes we look at the incarceration and history as facts and dates and things to be documented in books. And Paulette has really, I think, shown me a different way of approaching the past and the places we've come from. And so I wanted to hear you speak a little bit about, you briefly touched on that journey, but when I met you, I saw that you had seen something in your mother, and you were working with her to go on this spiritual path and sort of find something that had been lost. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you embarked on this journey and what it meant to you to sort of face history, and what were the reasons that drove you to that place. You could be easy not to do this work. I mean, maybe not for your spirit and for your heart, but it would be, it takes a lot of time and energy, and it's not always something that we get compensated for. So what is it that drove you to this journey?
Thank you for the question, Jeff. And I hope in our audience today that these words and these thoughts, but more the spirit that carries on, may touch you in a deep and healing way also. So about 8 years ago, I'm 56 right now, so into my 40s, I have the most amazing mother, and brilliant in so many ways, so intelligent and so beautiful and feisty, and an advocate for civil rights, and sometimes soft-spoken, but always standing up for people and what is right. But I wondered at times I would lose her throughout our childhood and throughout our life. I wondered where she would travel mentally and physically. It would seem as though all of a sudden she would become maybe 6, 8, 9 years old, and then would start a string of behaviors that were very difficult for a family at times, such as gambling and just mentally. If we had lost somebody in our family or in our community, that seemed to be a trigger. So I knew through doing healing work with my father and with others who were so kind enough to teach those ways, that the spirit has a journey also. And if something is not dealt with you always go back there, and it can hurt very much. And even if you don't see it, your family and those closest to you do. So throughout our lifetime, we would lose our beautiful, brilliant mother to another place. And I thought, oh my goodness, what is that place and where is that place? So I began the journey because I love my mom, because we all love Harriet, my mother, so much. I wanted to help her, if at all I humbly could, to become complete again. And I realized that we didn't know one single member of our Japanese ancestry beyond our immediate family. And I had the kindest, most gentle grandfather, Kamichi Miyasato, which, if you're looking at the screen, he is direct in the back row, directly above the little girl with the bow. That is Kamichi Miyasato. So he is full-blooded Japanese, and he married my mother. So what was the story? What happened to her as a little girl? So to answer your question, Jeff, it began because I wanted to go back to whatever painful place it was, to rewrite her story now so that it would end in a healing and a complete person, but tell the truth of what actually happened. So thank you for the question.
That image of your mother sort of stranded in a place, I think, is so powerful and so relatable, but so often we don't know that we have that place inside of us. And so I think you speaking that is really powerful to the people who are listening, and to, I think that's a condition of our modern times, is that there's this piece of us that has often been stranded. And so I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to sort of do that work with your mother, because like I said, you could have just not. And I think that there's the rewards aren't in capitalism, and the rewards aren't in sort of even like fame and prestige, but I think that it is a deep sort of healing that can happen. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about those specific emotions that, when there's that part of ourselves that's lost in that place, what are the emotions that sort of might translate into the outer world? And so when you've been dealing and working through this history, I personally would say sadness is one of the ones that I think for me is just like, some days you just sit in sadness for a long time. And that's part of ancestral work, is to say that, there's this sadness that the ancestors had that we have to process. And so I'm wondering for you in your journey, what those, just emotional, the texture of that has been like, and what have the most powerful or strongest emotions been?
Well, thank you, Jeff. Some of the strongest emotions, I guess I would go back with that question to what I feel in my heart as a little girl before we even came here. There seems to be a sense of completeness and wholeness, a sense of profound peace, like when you hold your breath underwater and you're just kind of floating. There's a solidness and a sense of peace. As we grow and we journey and through childhood and experiences, the perception of the world from outside that looks inside at our soul and begins to judge us and tell us that we don't measure up to par, begins with the shame and the hate, the rock throwing, the prejudice, the name calling, the many other things. What does that feel like? What is that emotion? That emotion is one that you are almost, you forget where you came from, that holy sacred place you came from, and somebody tells you that you're not sacred. And if you don't have the people around you through your culture or through your experiences, your inner circle, to help you deal with that, or you keep it to yourself, you begin kind of piling up and layering up these stones of deep hurt, of feeling like you don't belong. So in Alaska, we have such a beautiful place, beautiful island. I've never been to Japan. I understand it's beautiful also. But nature, as a little girl, I'd go out into nature, listen to the ocean, the trees, and I would seem to find a way to rebalance. There was perfect order in nature, from the very little tiny beings and animals of the sea and land and air, would rebalance that. But then I'd go back and I'd interact with people. And I knew, because of where I really came from, that I was whole. But I went through a journey of forgetting that wholeness because other people said I wasn't whole. So this story is about bringing that back again, but not just for myself, from my mother, for a family, and hopefully perhaps to somebody who's listening today. And you're part of that journey too. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have this really developed narrative about like anti-Japanese racism during the incarceration, because that's what the dominant people have experienced, you know? And so from the posters of the wartime, and, you know, that's very influenced by sort of the war and sort of Imperial Japan and the fear of Imperial Japan. But, you know, as I started to spend time with your family and with Harriet and listen to your stories, I realized that, you know, you have racism that's coming at you from all these different directions. And I think what that does is it's, you know, we have this sort of salve or this medicine for our anti-Japanese racism, because that's what we do when we come together as a community, as we form space. But because of the way that anti-Japanese racism, anti-Native racism, and all these things come together, it became that much more difficult to sort of hold it all together. And so I'm wondering how you know, do you understand those as separate things, as things that you hold together? And also, can you talk a little bit about how they affected your family and affected your mom? I know you have some stories about, you know, growing up, and it's like, you know, there's racism from the white society, but then there's also, you know, a lot of fear of Japanese people from the Native society at the time. And so just to speak a little bit about what those things, how they concretely sort of manifested in your family's story.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. That's quite a question. The picture we're looking at right now, to the left, the elderly lady with the scarf around her neck, is my great grandmother, Dot Shua, Annie Worthington. To the right of her are my aunties, Auntie Alice, Auntie Ede in the white dress, the eldest, and the one with the hand on his shoulder is my mother, Harriet. She was the youngest. This picture is taken in the Klawak. As you see, the women show their Japanese side. They're half Japanese and half Tlingit. In the small communities throughout Alaska, there was not a lot of Japanese people, but there were some that traveled over because they came from Japan and they settled in and married many of the Alaska Native women and men, and they settled into these villages. And before the war, there was a union, more than a marriage, like a spiritual union, even, because the Japanese people loved the ocean and loved the food and all the things that they could gather thereof. So that's what the picture is before you. As far as racism goes, for my mother being half Japanese and half Tlingit, the racism came not only from the Japanese, not only to the Japanese people when they were incarcerated, but those that were left behind, those in these small villages. And many of these villages are landlocked or only accessible, especially then, by boat. So many of the families stayed in these villages. So there may be only 50, a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 people throughout these villages. So there was not always a place you couldn't get in the car and drive to another place. You're on an island, you were in a community. The Tlingit culture is a beautiful culture and very, very, very special, very spiritual, very interrelated to the land and animals. But when the war came, it was difficult because my mother, she experienced racism not only from the non-Native people, but from our own Native people. Many of our people served in every war, every single war that there was, to defend their land. And some of the people would throw rocks at her and stones at her on her way to school and call her dirty Jap, dirty Indian. I think it was really hard for her to go from being a peaceable, somewhat childhood, accept it, and the Japanese people being accepted in these small communities, to all of a sudden having war hysteria and being called names. And nobody told her why. Nobody told her what was going on with the war. So she had to internalize that, her and her brothers and sisters. In the middle here is her eldest brother, Benny, and he's with some other men. And there was alcohol in those days, and there's many other things. But I think for me, my grandfather never talked about it, and neither did my mother or my uncles. It wasn't until recently, but I knew there was some sort of story there. And my father, being Hispanic, he was taken into a boarding school very young, at 3 years old, and he was raised in the Catholic boarding school, and that was extremely difficult. And my mom was at Wrangell Institute, then at Mount Edgecombe. So right away, somebody told my parents, Jeff, that because of their culture, because of their race, because of the way they came from the universe to this world, that they were less than. And what did they do, though? They turned around and became amazing advocates for civil rights. They raised their children to stand up. My mom said, you're not better than anybody else, but you're just as good. And we heard that throughout our life, but it wasn't until later, after we started achieving things, that I wondered where that came from. And now I understand a little bit more about their childhood. It's because they went through so much as children. And even though we didn't hear the stories then of the mission schools, the incarceration, I understand now why she says you are just as good as a person next to you, in the humblest way, but powerful nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think your mom is standing by.
Yes, my mom is.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll hear briefly from Harriet. So, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what you like. Now it's 70 years later or something. I'm not doing math properly, but a lot of time has passed, but we're still holding the complexity and the difficulty of these stories. And so I'm wondering, what are the pathways for transformation that you see? I know you've done some work with Alaska Native Sisterhood and the Brotherhood, which is Alaska Native rights, a civil rights organization. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering how you hope to harness your community and, Japanese American community, Tlingit community, to sort of bring a different energy to some of those difficult spaces, and what gives you hope in doing that?
Thank you, Jeff. I believe that we're born into this universe, and we go through these tunnels all the way from the galaxies and the stars to do a work. And that work is a sacred work. Don't ever let anybody tell you that it's not. And as we come here, we come in here through different variations of light, different cultures, different heritages, all very special, all part of so much more. Like every flower in a garden, it all has a purpose. So as we come here, when we see things that are unjust, when we see things that are wrong, when we hear people speak and see things in print, or hear stories, or see actions, if it's on the political scene, the world scale, or in whatever ways, this is our opportunity to speak. You speak when something is happening. You don't wait and then go home and then wish you would have spoke. Use your voice. Your voice is an instrument and a tool. And I don't think that we have, we don't have time to sit on the sidelines as things are happening. I know that my grandfather, Kamichi, was a very quiet and very humble man, but he's no longer with us. But I feel his presence when I speak. But what I do is I take a deep breath, insert myself in a situation, and speak for justice and speak for light. So the Japanese people have had a collective experience, and our collective experience means that we are not alone, but that together our voice is powerful and called upon to the world to make a difference right now. There are things happening in the world that are scary. There are things happening that are different, that we're being required to think of our own safety of our lives collectively and globally. The answers are not within policies or procedures. The answers are within our experiences. So what is it that the Japanese people, the Tlingit, the Native American, the Asian, the Hispanic, the Filipino, all the different cultures, what do we have to offer to this conversation? And I would say we have our voices. We have a unique experience to stand together as a people, to insert ourselves in worldwide conversation. But again, to draw on our unique heritage and the spiritual part of our heritage, the spiritual part of what it means to be Japanese, what it means to be a person of Indigenous heritage, and to take those tools, to use those as a reminder, and to speak what is true so that we could affect the future, so that the future is not something that our children fear. Thank you, Jeff.
Nanashish. So I just want to say that for me personally, you know, as a Japanese American, I think that we're often so disconnected from the land that we're on, and we're so unaware of its history, and we're so unaware of, you know, how to connect in a good way with the plant beings and the animal beings and the ancestors. And so, you know, I want to thank you for offering so generously those sort of gifts, whether it's physically in salmon or also just in knowledge. And I think that, you know, I couldn't imagine trying to understand my great-grandfather's story without that perspective. But when I look at other places on the West Coast, I think about how we're doing that. You know, when we talk about the Los Angeles community, are we in conversation with the Tongva people, contemporarily and historically? When we talk about the Seattle Japanese American community, do we know how to relate that to Duwamish histories? And I think oftentimes we don't do that. And I think it's, you know, it's a loss for everyone. And so I just want to thank you, and I want to say that hopefully, you know, I'm hoping that this can serve as sort of something that might trigger a change for our community as a whole, so that we can really start to understand the land that we're on, not just as property, not just as something that we own, not just as a tool in capitalism, but as something that will sustain us, and will sustain us as systems collapse and as the world starts to change. And so I think that, you know, you've offered and offer that sort of vision forward. And so just like, I think that that's, you know, that's what I hope as a, you know, talking to my community, I'm hoping that we sort of take that as a blessing and really, you know, take cues from that. And instead of saying, oh, I need to talk about my story, like really being able to listen to others. And I think that, you know, we've sort of created this vision. It's like, if it's not exactly about Japanese American stuff, it doesn't relate to us. And I think that that's dangerous, because we exist in relation. And so, you know, your existence and Harriet's existence is living flesh proof that that relation can't be denied. And I think that that's the way forward. So thank you, arigatou gozaimasu, for all that wisdom.
Thank you, Jeff. I just want a really quick closing comment, if I may.
Please.
I feel your heart, and I feel your spirit. And there's a reason why we're in this room right now, this visual chat room. And I'd like to say that it can be attempted to take so much from us, but every tree cannot be taken. Every bird cannot fall from the sky. Every fish, every raindrop, every ocean wave, we all have medicine to go to. We're going to be okay. And we're going to make it through this, because we're going to do it together. And our spirits come from a profound sacred place. And when we know that, and we acknowledge that, we are going to show the way and the light. So thank you for this time, and thank you for bringing me forward to Japanese people. That it's so healing for my mother and I. This is the first time in these last 8 years that we have been with our own Japanese people, beyond just our immediate family. So it's with all of our hearts that we say, Gunashish, arigato. And my mom, she's standing by. She's just
Yeah,
learning.
a little feature from Harriet. So Harriet's Harriet's waiting. Is she able to read the poem? Do you
Yeah,
know?
she's right here. Yeah. I'm
So
gonna
Harriet wrote a poem that sort of chronicles the journey that Paulette was speaking about. So we have the great pleasure of hearing from Harriet. Hi, Harriet.
Hi,
How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you.
You're the feature. You're the feature of our show. We've been waiting all this time for you.
Yeah, that's nice of you. Yeah, I've been waiting too.
speak really loud.
Yeah.
Okay, so are you able to share the poem that you wrote with us?
Oh, yes, I am.
Okay. And what's the poem called?
Unshed Tears. Unshed Tears. Yeah.
So Unshed Tears by Harriet Beleal.
Speak loud.
Okay. The other day, I felt a tear come down my face. It was part of the unshed tears I had suppressed for many years. I was in denial of these tears, refusing to let my feelings be known. Now I feel a stirring inside of me, like a dam overflowing, and I let the rest of my unshed tears flow freely for my dad and my brother George. How terrible it must have been to be treated as prisoners of war during World War II simply because we were Japanese. Flee from me, you who have tortured me all these years. You no longer have the power over me, for I am healing myself, spiritually, physically, mentally, and emotionally, as I tell my story and my unshed tears cease to exist. For all eternity, my earth family will have the only power, and I will be blessed by God, and someday, I will dwell in the house of the Lord and see my family again, God willing.
Amazing, Harriet. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think sometimes poetry sort of, we use big words and fancy things and we miss the point. And I think your poetry just hits us right in our heart. So thank you for those words. And I think everyone can take something from your journey. I'm wondering, do you have anything else you'd like to share? If you want to talk a little bit about what this journey with Paulette has meant for you, and also about, what it means to sort of revisit your family's wartime experience and to visit Minidoka. Anything that's on your mind.
Yeah, that was a real good experience to go to Minidoka and to see the little bunkhouse and the little mess house and be with the other Japanese American families and to really see where my brother George had to be when he was only 16 years old. And it brought it home to me. So, sometimes you don't understand the things that happen to you or why it's happening to you, but then when you go and share it with the other people that have experienced these things, you understand more. And when I saw that tower there and knew that they shot some of the Japanese people for trying to leave, and the river, and learned all the things that they went through, sharing it with the other Japanese families there, that was really a really healing experience for me. And I'm really happy that I got to go. Thank you very much. And I could talk on, but mostly with our connection with my dad and your grandfather, knowing that they traveled a long way and met up in Seattle, then in Juneau, and my dad cooked there in the city cafe, and hearing their story. It's really good to know other people's stories and to try to remember that God made us with diversity, and if we really thought hard about it, we would know that sharing our cultural diversity and our differences is what it was meant to be, not the other way around. It's supposed to be celebrated. And that's the thing that I would like to share with you today. We celebrate our families and our differences, and that's what America is about. On the shores, it's supposed to be welcoming the people that come, and that's the way it should be. Thank you for this opportunity, and God bless you too.
Thank you, Harriet. Harriet, can you show us a little what's on your vest?
Yeah, I have my different buttons, and little things I picked up at Tlingit Haida Convention and different places I went all over, Wrangell and Juneau and everywhere. They give me buttons and things. And this is a Tlingit vest I made. Then I have a raven on the back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who made the raven?
Margaret Gross Hope taught a class down at Totem Park, and she encouraged me to come down and work on a vest. So I went down there, and she helped me make the raven and learn how to sew and everything, because I didn't really like to sew too much. Yeah, but they had that class down there at Totem Park for a long time, and people went down to learn how to make the Tlingit blankets and the vests and everything. And to this day, they still have the ones that took her place, Sarah Williams and Maria Guthrie, that still teach and show the tourists the blankets and everything, that because the Tlingit people have a rich culture too, as I think you saw when you were up here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being the star of our show, Harriet.
Thank you very
You look
much.
good. You look like you're getting younger every day.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Is Paulette gone? I think we're good.
I'm right here.
Oh, you're right here. Okay.
Yeah. She's pretty cute, isn't she? 86 years old. She runs circles around us.
Amazing. All right. Well, any last words you'd like to share, Paulette, before we wrap up? We didn't really have time for questions, but I think that we touched on a lot of things that people might have asked about. So,
yeah, I would say that making this journey for our loved ones, our parents or our grandparents, really will affect how our message to our children. And please take this healing journey. It's long and it's hard, and sometimes it'll be difficult to see the pain that is in the ones you love. But I can say, just through my own experiences, that it's worth seeing that pain, and it's worth putting healing salve on that plane so they can have a better life. And my mom is a healing story, and I hope to hear others' healing stories. So have courage and take that journey with those that you love. And Jeff, when you do come back to Sitka, we have some seaweed for you, some red ribbon seaweed, some salmon, halibut, many different things. So we can cook just like our great grandfathers did. Yeah. So the message is have courage, be strong, tell your story, and go to that painful place so that your loved ones don't live the rest of their life in pain, that they live their life as they were intended to be, a complete and whole soul from the universe sent here to Earth to leave here in a good way. So it's worth the journey. Yes.
All right. Well, I can't add anything to that. That's what it is. So thank you so much, Paulette, and thank you, Aaron, and everyone else who's been behind the scenes in making this happen. It's a great way to be able to share. So yeah, everyone, and thank you for listening and being our audience and witness to this journey. That's
Thank you too, Jeff. Thank you.
All right.